Congratulations, Miss Thompson. You now own the entire fleet. The notification on Aisha Thompson's cracked iPhone 11 lit up the dim corner of JFK's first-class lounge, where she sat hunched over a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Around her, the cream of New York society sipped Dom Perignon and discussed their summer homes in the Hamptons, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman in the faded Howard University hoodie had just become the sole owner of Prestige Airways. Aisha stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the confirmation email from her legal team. The wire transfer had gone through 20 minutes ago, $4.7 billion, the largest single acquisition by an individual in airline history, and she was sitting here looking like she'd gotten lost on her way to the economy gate. The irony wasn't lost on her, and honestly, it was exactly what she'd planned. She pulled the hood up over her natural hair, which she'd deliberately left in its wash-and-go state this morning, instead of the sleek press she usually wore to board meetings. The backpack at her feet was held together with duct tape in two places, not because she couldn't afford a new one, but because this particular bag had carried her through 7 years of night shifts at the Marriott downtown, where she'd cleaned rooms during the day and coded her revolutionary health app VitalLink on napkins and the back of room service receipts during her breaks. That same app had just made her richer than 99% of the people sitting in this lounge, but looking at her now, you'd think she was waiting for someone to offer her a job wiping down their tables. "Ma'am, I think you might be in the wrong lounge," a perfectly manicured voice said from above her. Aisha looked up to see a blonde woman in an expensive cream-colored suit, the kind that probably cost more than most people made in a month. The woman's smile was polite but cold, the kind flight attendants gave you when they were about to move you to a smaller seat. "No, I'm exactly where I need to be," Aisha replied softly, holding up her boarding pass on her phone screen. "Flight 447 to London, departing in 30 minutes. The woman's eyes flicked over Aisha's appearance, the hoodie, the scuffed sneakers, the backpack that looked like it had survived a war, and her smile became even more strained. "Oh well, if you're sure, but I just want to make sure you know that this lounge is exclusively for first-class passengers and our Platinum Elite members." Aisha had heard variations of this conversation her entire life, but it still made her chest tighten with a familiar mix of anger and sadness. She remembered being 16, walking into a department store with her mother after church, both of them dressed in their Sunday best, only to have a security guard follow them around like they were planning to steal something. She remembered being the only black student in her computer science classes at Howard, having professors assume she was in the wrong classroom, until she proved she belonged there with her work. But this time was different, because this time she had the power to do something about it. "I appreciate your concern," she said, keeping her voice level and friendly, "but I'm definitely supposed to be here. First class seat 1A, if that helps. Put your mind at ease." The woman's eyebrows shot up almost to her hairline. "Seat 1A? That's our flagship suite. It's quite expensive." "I'm aware," Aisha said, taking another sip of her cold coffee and trying not to smile. "I've done my research." What the woman didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Aisha had spent the last 6 months doing a lot more than research. She'd been investigating Prestige Airways from top to bottom, reading every customer complaint, every employee review, every discrimination lawsuit that had been quietly settled out of court. The picture that emerged was ugly, an airline that treated customers like royalty or garbage, depending on how much money they appeared to have, with staff who had learned to size people up in seconds and provide service accordingly. She'd heard stories from friends, colleagues, even strangers on social media, about the subtle and not-so-subtle ways they'd been made to feel unwelcome on flights, treated like they didn't belong in the seats they'd paid for. As someone who'd worked in hospitality for years, Aisha knew the difference between busy service and discriminatory service, between having a bad day and having bad character. The acquisition of Prestige Airways hadn't been a business decision for her, it had been personal. She wanted to see firsthand how her new employees treated customers when they thought no one important was watching, and more importantly, she wanted to fix it from the inside out. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from her assistant board meeting, moved to Thursday. Safe travels, and remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. But that was where her assistant was wrong. Aisha had everything to prove, not to herself, but to every person who'd ever been made to feel small because of how they looked or where they came from. Every housekeeper who'd been treated like they were invisible. Every person who'd been followed around a store. Every student who'd been underestimated because of the color of their skin. She stood up, shouldering her battle-worn backpack, and walked toward the gate. The blonde woman watched her go with obvious confusion, probably wondering how someone dressed like a college student could afford a seat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The gate area was buzzing with the usual pre-flight energy business travelers typing frantically on their laptops, families trying to corral excited children, flight crew making their final preparations. Aisha spotted her plane through the large windows, a Boeing 787 that she now technically owned, and felt a strange mix of pride and nervousness. She'd flown this route dozens of times over the years, back when she was scraping together miles and upgrade certificates just to get a decent seat. Now she owned the airline, but she was about to find out if owning something and changing its culture were the same thing. Final boarding call for Prestige Airways Flight 447 to London Heathrow. The gate agent announced. We're now boarding all remaining passengers. Aisha walked toward the gate, her heart beating a little faster with each step. She had no idea what the next few hours would bring. But she had a feeling that by the time they landed in London, everything would be different. She just didn't know how different. The first person Aisha saw as she approached the aircraft door was exactly what she'd expected, and everything she'd feared about her new airline rolled into one person. Madison Pierce stood at the entrance of the plane like a sentinel, her uniform pressed to perfection, every blonde hair in place, her red lipstick applied with surgical precision. She looked like she'd stepped out of a 1950s airline advertisement, all polish and professional smile, but there was something cold behind her eyes that made Aisha's stomach tighten with recognition. She'd seen that look before in the eyes of hotel managers who'd spoken differently to her than they did to her white co-workers, in the faces of customers who'd asked to speak to someone else when she'd tried to help them. It was the look of someone who'd decided your worth before you'd even opened your mouth. "Good evening and welcome aboard Prestige Airways," Madison said to the businessman ahead of Aisha, in line, her voice warm and syrupy. "Mr. Whitfield, isn't it? We have your usual champagne chilled and ready, and I've made sure your jacket will be pressed and waiting for you when we land." The man beamed at her. "Madison, you always take such good care of me. This is why I fly Prestige exclusively." "It's our pleasure, sir. Enjoy your flight." Aisha watched the interaction with professional interest. This was customer service at its finest, personalized, attentive, making the passenger feel valued and important. It was exactly what every customer deserved, regardless of how much they'd paid or what they looked like. She stepped forward, holding out her boarding pass on her phone screen. Madison's smile didn't fade, but it changed, becoming somehow less genuine, more mechanical. Her eyes swept over Aisha's appearance in a quick, practiced assessment that Aisha recognized immediately. "I'm sorry, miss, but I think there might be some confusion," Madison said, her voice still pleasant but noticeably cooler. "The economy boarding area is just over there to your left. This entrance is reserved for our first-class passengers." "I know," Aisha said calmly. "I'm in seat 1A. Madison's laugh was light and dismissive. "Oh, honey, that's our premier suite. It's our most expensive accommodation. Are you sure you didn't mean 31A? Sometimes the app can be a little confusing." Behind Madison, Aisha could see a younger flight attendant watching the interaction with obvious discomfort. The girl looked to be in her early 20s with kind eyes and nervous energy, and she kept glancing between Madison and Aisha like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. "I'm very sure," Aisha said, keeping her voice steady. Seat 1, Aisha Thompson. Madison's smile became even more strained. She reached for the handheld scanner at her station, making a show of sighing dramatically. Well, let me just check this for you, though. I'm sure there's been some sort of system error or maybe an upgrade glitch. She aimed the scanner at Aisha's phone, clearly expecting it to beep red with rejection. Beep. Green light. Seat 1, A, confirmed. Madison stared at the scanner like it had personally betrayed her. She tapped it against her palm, then scanned the phone again. Beep. Green light. Seat 1A. This must be some kind of mistake, Madison muttered, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. System errors, you know how it is. Is there a problem here? A deep voice boomed from behind Aisha. She turned to see a man in an expensive suit pushing past her, not bothering to excuse himself as his shoulder knocked into hers. He was tall, broad, and carried himself with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from never having to wait in line or explain yourself to anyone. Mr. Blackwood Madison's face lit up like Christmas morning. No problem at all, just dealing with a small technical issue with this passenger's boarding pass. We'll have it sorted out in just a moment. Richard Blackwood looked Aisha up and down with obvious distaste. Well, sort it out quickly. Some of us have actual business to attend to in first class. Madison giggled. Actually giggled like a schoolgirl with a crush. Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Your seat is ready, and I've arranged for that special scotch you like to be served immediately after takeoff. That's why I fly with you people, Richard said, pushing past Aisha again. You understand that service means taking care of the right customers. Aisha felt her jaw clench, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of behavior she'd suspected was happening, and seeing it firsthand made her more determined than ever to root it out completely. The young flight attendant stepped forward tentatively. Madison, maybe I should... Emma, please prepare the main cabin for boarding. Madison cut her off sharply. I can handle this. Emma Rodriguez shot Aisha an apologetic look before disappearing into the aircraft. Aisha made a mental note to remember her name and her experience. The people who looked uncomfortable when witnessing unfair treatment were often the ones with the character to do better when given the chance. Madison turned back to Aisha, her smile now completely artificial. Look, I don't know how you got this boarding pass, but I'm going to need to see some ID and a credit card to verify your identity before I can let you board. You didn't ask him for ID, Aisha pointed out, nodding toward where Richard Blackwood had disappeared into the first-class cabin. That's different, Madison said quickly. Mr. Blackwood is a frequent flyer. He's family to us. And I'm a paying customer with a valid boarding pass, Aisha replied. So unless you're asking everyone for additional ID, which I notice you're not, I'd like to take my seat, please. Madison's mask slipped for just a moment, and Aisha saw something ugly flash across her face. Fine, she said through clenched teeth. But I'll be watching you. One step out of line, one complaint from our other passengers, and you'll be off this plane before we reach cruising altitude. Aisha nodded politely. I'll be sure to keep that in mind. As she walked into the aircraft, she could feel Madison's eyes boring into her back. The first-class cabin was everything she'd expected. Spacious suites with sliding doors, lie-flat beds, personal entertainment systems, and enough legroom for someone to do yoga. Her seat 1A was at the very front, the crown jewel of the cabin. She settled in, stowing her backpack in the overhead bin and pulling out her phone to make some notes. Madison's behavior was exactly what she'd feared she'd find, but it was also exactly what she needed to document if she was going to make real changes. Emma appeared at her seat a few minutes later, carrying a glass of champagne on a silver tray. Her hands were shaking slightly. Complimentary champagne before takeoff, she asked quietly. Thank you, Aisha, said, accepting the glass. That's very kind. Emma glanced around nervously, then leaned in slightly. I just want you to know that, well, not everyone here thinks the way Madison does. Some of us actually care about treating all passengers well regardless of, you know. Aisha looked up at the young woman, seeing something genuine in her eyes that had been completely absent from Madison's interactions. "What's your name, Emma Rodriguez?" she said. "I've been working here for about a year. Nice to meet you, Emma. I'm Aisha." "Listen," Emma said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Madison told the crew that you're probably flying on some kind of employee pass or contest ticket, and she said, we shouldn't waste the premium service on you. But that's not right, and I wanted you to know that if you need anything during the flight, anything at all, you can ask me." Aisha felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the champagne. In all her research, in all her planning, she hadn't considered that she might find allies among the staff people who were just as frustrated with the culture of discrimination as she was. "Thank you, Emma," she said. "That means more than you know." Emma smiled and moved on to serve the other passengers, and Aisha watched as Madison emerged from the galley to supervise. The difference in the senior flight attendant's demeanor was stark. With Richard Blackwood, she was flirtatious and attentive with the elderly Chinese woman in 3B. She was polite, but distant, and with the young mother trying to settle her crying baby, she was visibly annoyed. But it was the way Madison looked at Emma that concerned Aisha the most. There was something predatory in her gaze, like she was waiting for the younger woman to make a mistake so she could pounce on her. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Aisha made herself a promise. By the time they landed in London, things were going to be very different aboard Prestige Airways. She just had to be patient long enough to see exactly how deep the problems ran. The plane lifted off into the night sky, carrying her toward what she hoped would be a reckoning that was long overdue. 20 minutes after takeoff, when the seatbelt sign had chimed off and the cabin service was supposed to begin, Aisha was still waiting for someone to offer her so much as a glass of water. She watched from her seat as Madison moved through the first-class cabin like a queen holding court, chatting and laughing with Richard Blackwood, personally adjusting the elderly woman's blanket in 3B, and even taking a moment to coo over the baby that the young mother in row 5 was trying to keep calm. But somehow Madison's path never quite made it to seat 1A. It wasn't accidental, Aisha knew. It was deliberate, calculated, and unfortunately it was probably effective most of the time. How many passengers would complain about being ignored? How many would just assume the flight attendant was busy and would get to them eventually? How many would feel too uncomfortable to make a fuss, especially if they suspected the treatment was connected to who they were, rather than what they'd paid for? Aisha pressed the call button above her seat. Nothing happened. She waited 5 minutes, then pressed it again. Still nothing. Finally, she saw Emma hurrying down the aisle with a tray of glasses, and she gently raised her hand to get her attention. "Excuse me," Aisha said softly when Emma approached. "I was wondering if I could get something to drink." I pressed the call button, but... Emma's face flushed with embarrassment. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." "Of course, absolutely. What would you like? We have champagne wine cocktails or any soft drinks you prefer. Just some water would be great, thank you." "Still or sparkling? And would you like some nuts or olives with that?" Before Aisha could answer, Madison appeared beside Emma like a shadow. "Emma, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I was just getting Ms. Thompson something to drink," Emma said, her confidence immediately deflating. "I specifically told you that I would handle the premier section," Madison said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Why don't you go check on the main cabin? I'm sure there are passengers back there who actually need assistance." Emma shot Aisha an apologetic look and hurried away, leaving Madison standing beside the seat with her hands clasped behind her back and that same cold smile fixed in place. "Now then," Madison said, "what seems to be the problem?" "No problem," Aisha replied calmly. "I just asked for some water." "Water," Madison repeated, like Aisha had requested liquid gold. "Well, I suppose I can find something for you, though. I should mention that our premium beverage service is typically reserved for our full-fare passengers and elite members. Aisha felt her patience beginning to fray, but she kept her voice level. I'm happy to pay full fare. In fact, I believe I did. Madison's laugh was musical and condescending. Oh, honey, I'm sure you got a great deal on your ticket, but the Premier Suite isn't exactly accessible to most people. Are you perhaps traveling on a company voucher? Or maybe you won a contest? The assumptions were so blatant, so rooted in prejudice, that Aisha almost couldn't believe what she was hearing. Almost. The truth was, she'd been expecting exactly this kind of treatment, hoping she was wrong, but expecting it nonetheless. I paid full price, she said simply. $6,500. Madison's eyebrows shot up, and for a moment her mask slipped completely. $6,500, she repeated. For one seat. That's correct. Well, Madison said, her smile becoming even more strained. I suppose mistakes do happen. System glitches, payment processing errors, that sort of thing. But don't worry, we'll sort it all out when we land. She turned to walk away without bringing the requested water. Excuse me, Aisha called after her. My water. Madison paused, her shoulders tensing. We're currently running low on our premium bottled water, but I can bring you something from the tap if you'd like. Aisha looked across the aisle where Richard Blackwood was sipping from a crystal glass of what was clearly bottled water condensation beading on the outside. That would be fine, she said. 10 minutes later, Emma appeared with a plastic cup filled with lukewarm tap water. I'm so sorry, Emma whispered as she set it down. Madison said this was what you requested, but I know it's not right. If you want, I can... It's okay, Aisha said gently. Thank you for bringing it. But it wasn't okay, and they both knew it. What was happening was discrimination, pure and simple, and it was being carried out with a smile and a sweet voice that made it almost impossible to call out without seeming difficult or demanding. Aisha pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. Madison Pierce, she typed. Senior flight attendant. Assumptions about payment method refused premium service provided substandard alternative while serving others normally. She was building a case not just against Madison, but against the entire culture that allowed this kind of treatment to flourish. Every slight, every assumption, every moment of disrespect was going into her record, because when she revealed who she was, she wanted there to be no question about what needed to change. As the flight continued into the night, the pattern became even more obvious. Madison fawned over Richard Blackwood, bringing him multiple cocktails without being asked personally, selecting his meal, and even offering to have his jacket pressed during the flight. The elderly woman received polite but professional service, nothing special, but nothing deliberately poor either. The young mother was treated with barely concealed irritation. Madison sighing audibly whenever the baby cried and making pointed comments about some people not knowing how to control their children in first class. And Aisha, she received nothing at all unless she specifically requested it, and even then it came with excuses, delays, and inferior alternatives to what other passengers were offered. By the time the meal service began 2 hours into the flight, Aisha had documented 17 separate instances of discriminatory treatment. She'd been offered no pre-flight amenities, no hot towels, no menu selection, and no information about the flight or services available. When Madison finally approached with a meal tray, she set it down with obvious reluctance. We had a mix-up in the galley, she said, not bothering to make eye contact. The lobster and the beef were both spoken for, so I brought you the vegetarian option. I hope that's acceptable. Aisha looked at the sad-looking pasta primavera on her tray, then across the aisle where Richard was being served what looked like perfectly prepared lobster thermidor. Actually, she said, I'd prefer the lobster, please. Madison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As I said, that's been spoken for. The vegetarian option is quite good. I'm sure you'll find it satisfactory. By spoken for, do you mean it's been reserved for specific passengers? Aisha asked. Well, yes, for our Platinum Elite members and full-fare first-class passengers. I am a full-fare first-class passenger, Aisha pointed out. Madison's face flushed slightly. Look, miss, I don't know what game you're playing here, but I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I can tell the difference between someone who belongs in first class and someone who doesn't. So why don't you just eat your pasta and stop making trouble for everyone else? The words hung in the air between them, finally spoken out loud instead of just implied through actions and tone. Aisha felt her heartbeat quicken not with fear, but with a cold, focused anger that she recognized from her childhood, from every time someone had tried to make her feel small or unwelcome. What exactly do you mean by that? Aisha asked quietly. Madison realized she'd gone too far, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. I think you know exactly what I mean. Some people need to learn that money can't buy you class, and it certainly can't buy you respect. Aisha stared at her for a long moment, then reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone. She found the contact she needed and pressed call. What are you doing? Madison asked suddenly, sounding less confident. Calling the captain, Aisha said as the phone began to ring. I think he needs to know about the kind of service his passengers are receiving. Madison's face went white. You can't just call the captain. Passengers don't have direct access to Captain Mitchell, Aisha said when the call connected. This is Thompson. We have a situation in the first-class cabin that requires your immediate attention. The silence that followed was so profound that Aisha could hear the hum of the aircraft's engines and the quiet conversations of other passengers. Madison stood frozen beside her seat, watching as everything she thought she knew about power and hierarchy began to crumble around her. Yes, sir, Aisha continued into the phone. Row 1, seat A. I'll be here when you're ready. She ended the call and looked up at Madison, whose face had gone from white to green. You might want to sit down, Aisha suggested gently. This conversation is about to get very interesting. The aftermath of Aisha's phone call created a strange, tense atmosphere throughout the first-class cabin, like the moment before a thunderstorm when you can feel electricity in the air but the lightning hasn't struck yet. Madison had retreated to the galley, her confident swagger replaced by nervous pacing and whispered conversations with the other crew members, while Emma kept shooting concerned glances toward Aisha's seat, clearly sensing that something significant was about to happen but not understanding what. Richard Blackwood, who had been thoroughly enjoying his lobster thermidor and premium scotch, was now watching the drama unfold with the fascination of someone who'd stumbled onto a reality TV show during a boring flight. Trouble in paradise, he called over to Aisha with a smirk. I told them they should have checked your ticket more carefully. These discount travel sites are getting out of hand, letting just anyone think they belong up here with the rest of us. Aisha turned to look at him. Really look at him. Taking in the expensive suit, the Rolex that caught the cabin lights, the air of casual entitlement that surrounded him like cologne. She'd researched him too during her investigation of the airline's passenger demographics, and what she'd found wasn't impressive. Richard Blackwood ran a hedge fund that specialized in what he liked to call distressed opportunities, buying up companies during economic downturns and stripping them for parts. During the pandemic, when airlines were struggling to survive and thousands of employees were being laid off, his fund had made a fortune betting against the industry, profiting from other people's misery while lounging in the same first-class seats that those unemployed workers could no longer afford. Something like that, she replied quietly, turning back to her untouched pasta. Madison emerged from the galley carrying a fresh drink for Richard, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to maintain her professional composure. The confident woman who had dismissed Aisha at boarding was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she was trying very hard not to panic. Your usual scotch, Mr. Blackwood, she said, setting the glass down with exaggerated care. And I wanted to personally apologize for any disruption to your flight experience. Sometimes we get passengers who don't understand how things work up here. Richard accepted the drink with a knowing nod. No need to apologize to me, Madison. You've always taken excellent care of me, which is why I fly Prestige exclusively. It's not your fault when people try to take advantage of the system." The conversation was clearly meant for Aisha to overhear a not-so-subtle attempt to put her in her place and reinforce the social hierarchy that Madison was so invested in maintaining. But what neither of them understood was that their words were only strengthening Aisha's resolve to tear down that hierarchy completely. She pulled out her phone again and added to her notes, "Flight attendant and passenger," discussing problem passenger within earshot, attempting to shame and isolate. Then she switched to her camera and began taking photos of her meal, the lukewarm pasta, the plastic fork. Instead of the silver flatware, other passengers had received the paper napkin instead of the cloth ones she could see at Richard's seat. "Excuse me," Madison said sharply, appearing beside her seat again. "Photography is not permitted during flight service." Aisha looked up from her phone. "I don't see that rule posted anywhere, and I didn't see you tell Mr. Blackwood that when he was taking pictures of his meal earlier." That's different," Madison stammered. "How is it different?" Madison's face flushed red, and for a moment Aisha thought she might actually tell the truth about why it was different. Instead, she fell back on the authority of her position. "As senior flight attendant, I have the discretion to determine what activities might disrupt the flight or disturb other passengers," she said, her voice rising slightly. "And right now, I'm determining that your behavior is becoming disruptive." "My behavior." Aisha kept her voice calm and level. "I've been sitting quietly in my seat eating my meal and taking photos of my food. How exactly is that disruptive?" "You're creating a disturbance," Madison said, her professional mask slipping further. "You're making the other passengers uncomfortable." Emma appeared at the edge of the conversation, carrying a tray of coffee cups and looking increasingly distressed. She'd obviously been listening, and the conflict between her training to provide good service and Madison's explicit instructions not to treat Aisha well was creating visible stress. "Maybe I could help with something," Emma offered tentatively. "No," Madison said sharply. "I can handle this. Why don't you check on the passengers in rows 6 through 12? Emma hesitated, looking at Aisha with obvious concern, but ultimately followed orders and moved toward the back of the first-class section. The elderly Chinese woman in seat 3B, Mrs. Chen, had been quietly observing the entire interaction while pretending to read her book. Now she cleared her throat and spoke for the first time since boarding. "Excuse me," she said in accented but clear English, addressing Madison directly. "I have been watching, and I do not understand why this young lady is being treated differently than other passengers. She seems very polite to me." Madison's face went through several emotional contortions as she processed this unexpected intervention. Mrs. Chen was clearly a paying first-class passenger, well-dressed and polite, the kind of customer Madison couldn't afford to offend. But her observation threatened the entire foundation of Madison's justification for treating Aisha poorly. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your concern," Madison said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional courtesy. "But this is really a matter between myself and this passenger regarding some irregularities with her ticket." "What irregularities?" Mrs. Chen asked, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Her boarding pass was accepted, was it not? She is sitting in the seat assigned to her." "Well, yes, but then what is the irregularity?" Madison opened and closed her mouth several times, clearly struggling to find a way to explain her behavior. That didn't sound discriminatory when stated out loud in front of witnesses. Richard Blackwood, sensing that the conversation was not going in the direction he'd expected, decided to escalate his involvement. "Look, ladies," he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he probably used in boardrooms. "I think we all know what's going on here. Some people will do anything to get into first class, fake tickets, stolen credit cards, identity theft. Madison is just doing her job protecting the integrity of the service we paid for." The accusation was so blatant, so clearly rooted in assumptions about Aisha's race and appearance, that even Mrs. Chen gasped audibly. Sir Mrs. Chen said, her voice sharp with disapproval, "That is a very serious accusation to make about someone without any evidence." "The evidence is sitting right there," Richard replied, gesturing toward Aisha. "Look at her. Look at how she's dressed, and then ask yourself honestly whether she looks like someone who can afford a $6,500 airline seat." The words hung in the air like poison, finally giving voice to what had been implied throughout the entire flight. Aisha felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, not hurt. She was long past being hurt by the opinions of people like Richard Blackwood, but a crystal-clear understanding of exactly what she was dealing with and exactly what needed to be done about it. She stood up slowly, her full height bringing her eye to eye with Madison, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly throughout the cabin. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, not taking her eyes off Madison, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I don't look like most people who sit in first class. I look like someone who worked 3 jobs to put herself through college, someone who cleaned hotel rooms and served tables and coded software until her fingers bled, someone who earned every single thing she has instead of inheriting it or taking it from other people." She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued. "But here's what you don't understand. I don't need to look like I belong anywhere because I make the places I go belong to me." Madison was staring at her with something approaching fear now, as if she was finally beginning to understand that she'd made a terrible mistake, but couldn't yet grasp the full scope of it. Aisha sat back down and pulled out her phone again, but this time she didn't call Captain Mitchell. Instead, she scrolled through her contacts until she found a different number 1 that would connect her directly to the Prestige Airways corporate office in New York. "What are you doing now?" Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Calling my lawyer," Aisha replied, pressing the call button. "I think it's time we discussed exactly what irregularities there are with my ticket. Don't you?" The call to her lawyer served multiple purposes, none of which Madison or Richard could have understood. Officially, Aisha was documenting the discriminatory treatment she'd received and creating a legal record that would protect both her and any employees who might later claim they were just following orders. Unofficially, she was buying time while Captain Mitchell made his way from the cockpit and sending a very clear message that she wasn't some random passenger they could intimidate into silence. "Yes, I need you to start a documentation file," she said into the phone, speaking loudly enough for Madison and Richard to hear every word. "Flight 447, Prestige Airways, JFK to Heathrow. Multiple instances of discriminatory service hostile treatment and what appear to be allegations of credit card fraud based solely on passenger appearance." Madison had gone completely pale, the reality of potential legal action apparently cutting through whatever confidence she'd derived from Richard's support. She kept opening her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closing it again when she couldn't find words that wouldn't make the situation worse. "No, I don't want to settle," Aisha continued. "I want a full investigation, and I want everyone from the flight attendants to the gate agents to the corporate executives who created this culture to understand that this behavior has consequences." Richard, meanwhile, was beginning to look less amused and more concerned. He'd clearly expected this to be a brief entertainment where an uppity passenger got put in her place, not a serious legal situation that might reflect poorly on his own behavior. Emma had returned from checking on the other passengers and was hovering uncertainly at the edge of the galley, obviously wanting to help, but not sure how. When she caught Aisha's eye, she mouthed, "I'm sorry," and looked like she might start crying. Mrs. Chen had put down her book entirely and was watching the proceedings with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades observing human behavior and drawing conclusions about character. The young mother in row 5, Sarah, was trying to keep her baby calm while obviously listening to every word of the conversation, her eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and secondhand embarrassment for Madison. "I'll hold," Aisha said into the phone, then looked up at Madison. "My lawyer wants to speak with you directly about the specific allegations that have been made against me." Something about stolen credit cards and fake tickets. I told her you'd be happy to provide details about what evidence you have to support those claims. Madison's face went from pale to green. I never said anything about stolen credit cards. No, that was your friend Mr. Blackwood, Aisha said, glancing over at Richard, who was suddenly very interested in the contents of his scotch glass. But you agreed with him, and more importantly, you've been treating me like a criminal since the moment I boarded this aircraft. I was trying to maintain the integrity of the first-class service, Madison said weakly. By refusing to serve me. By giving me plastic utensils while other passengers get silver. By offering me tap water while Mr. Blackwood gets premium bottled water. By assuming I couldn't afford my ticket and treating me accordingly. Each question hit like a physical blow, and Madison seemed to shrink a little more with each one. The carefully constructed justifications she'd been using to rationalize her behavior were crumbling under the weight of having to defend them out loud. I treat all passengers professionally, she stammered. Mrs. Chen made a soft sound of disagreement. Young lady, she said to Madison, I have been traveling for 70 years, and I have seen professional service and unprofessional service. What you have been doing is not professional. The elderly woman's words carried an authority that seemed to cut right through Madison's defenses. This wasn't some young troublemaker or difficult passenger speaking. This was someone with decades of experience who had observed the situation objectively and found Madison's behavior lacking. Mrs. Chen, I respect your opinion, Madison said, her voice shaking now. But you don't understand the pressures we face, the security concerns, the need to verify that passengers actually belong in premium cabins. What security concerns? Mrs. Chen asked pointedly. Did this young lady threaten anyone? Did she cause any disturbance before you began treating her poorly? Madison couldn't answer that question without admitting that there had been no security concerns, that her treatment of Aisha had been based entirely on appearance and assumptions. She was being difficult, Madison said weakly. How was she being difficult? Mrs. Chen pressed. By asking for water, by requesting the meal she was entitled to, by taking photographs of food she had paid for. Emma, who had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, finally found the courage to speak up. Madison, she said quietly, maybe we should treat Miss Thompson the same way we treat everyone else. I don't understand why this has to be so complicated. Madison spun around to face Emma, and for a moment her professional mask slipped, completely revealing something ugly underneath. Because, Emma, some of us understand that first class isn't just about the seat you're sitting in, it's about maintaining standards. It's about understanding that not everyone belongs everywhere, regardless of how much money they claim to have. The words were out before Madison could stop them hanging in the air like a confession. Even Richard looked uncomfortable now, perhaps realizing that his casual bigotry had encouraged something much more toxic than he'd intended. Aisha felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. Madison had finally said out loud what had been driving her behavior all along, not security concerns or professional standards, but simple prejudice dressed up in the language of customer service. I see, Aisha said quietly. So, in your professional opinion, I don't belong in first class because of who I am not, because of what I've paid or how I've behaved. Madison realized she'd walked into a trap, but it was too late to backtrack. That's not... I didn't mean... What did you mean? Aisha asked. Madison looked around the cabin desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue her from the hole she'd dug for herself. But Richard was suddenly fascinated by his drink. Emma was looking at her with something approaching horror. Mrs. Chen was shaking her head in disapproval, and even Sarah was staring at her with obvious disgust. I meant... Madison tried again, but the words wouldn't come. The phone in Aisha's hand buzzed, and she looked down to see a text from Captain Mitchell. on my way to the cabin. 2 minutes. Perfect timing, Madison Aisha said, standing up again. I want you to understand something very clearly. When Captain Mitchell gets here, and when we land in London and when the investigation begins, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that you had multiple opportunities to treat me with basic human dignity, and you chose not to. I want you to remember that your behavior wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about maintaining your sense of superiority over someone you decided wasn't worthy of respect. Madison was openly crying now, tears running down her cheeks and smearing her carefully applied makeup. Please, she whispered, I can't lose this job. I have bills, I have a mortgage. You should have thought about that before you decided that some passengers deserve respect and others don't, Aisha replied. The sound of footsteps in the aisle made everyone turn, and Captain Mitchell appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin. He was exactly what Aisha had expected from their phone conversations, tall, distinguished, with the kind of commanding presence that comes from decades of being responsible for the lives of everyone on board his aircraft. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in Madison's tear-streaked face, Richard's guilty expression, Mrs. Chen's disapproving posture, and Emma's obvious distress before finally settling on Aisha. Ms. Thompson, he said formally, I understand we have a situation. We do indeed, Captain Aisha replied. I think it's time everyone understood exactly what kind of situation it is. Captain Mitchell's presence in the cabin created an immediate shift in the atmosphere, the kind of gravity that comes when someone with ultimate authority enters a space where that authority has been questioned. He stood at the front of the first-class section, his 4 stripes clearly visible on his shoulders, and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades managing crises at 35,000 feet. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. I apologize for the interruption to your flight, but I need to address a situation that has been brought to my attention. Madison wiped frantically at her tear-stained cheeks, trying to compose herself, while Richard sat up straighter in his seat, the casual arrogance he'd displayed earlier replaced by the nervous energy of someone who suddenly realized he might be in trouble. Emma stood frozen by the galley, her eyes darting between the captain and Madison like she was watching a tennis match that might determine her career. Mrs. Chen closed her book and gave the captain her full attention while Sarah bounced her baby gently and tried to look invisible, despite being obviously fascinated by the drama unfolding around her. Ms. Thompson, Captain Mitchell said, turning to face Aisha directly, would you please explain what has occurred during this flight? Aisha stood up, her phone still in her hand, the Notes app open to several pages of documented incidents. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and utterly professional. Captain Mitchell, since boarding this aircraft, I have been systematically denied the services and amenities that other first-class passengers have received based solely on assumptions about my ability to pay for my ticket and my right to be in this cabin. She looked at Madison, whose face had gone white again. Your senior flight attendant, Ms. Pierce, refused to provide me with the meal I requested, gave me plastic utensils, while other passengers received silver, served me tap water in a plastic cup, while others received premium bottled water in crystal glasses, and repeatedly questioned the validity of my boarding pass, despite it being confirmed by your scanning system. Those are serious allegations, Captain Mitchell said gravely. There's more, Aisha continued. When I attempted to document the discriminatory treatment by photographing my meal, I was told that photography wasn't allowed despite other passengers being permitted to take photos. When I pressed the call button for service, it was ignored. When your junior flight attendant, Ms. Rodriguez, attempted to provide proper service, she was reprimanded in front of me. Emma's face flushed red, but she nodded when the captain looked at her for confirmation. And finally, Aisha said, her voice hardening slightly. Mr. Blackwood here accused me of using stolen credit cards and fake tickets to obtain my seat, allegations that Miss Pierce appeared to support. All eyes turned to Richard, who looked like he desperately wanted to disappear into his leather seat. Now, wait just a minute, he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. I never specifically said anything about stolen credit cards. You said I looked like someone who would use fake tickets, stolen credit cards, or identity theft to get into first class? Aisha replied calmly. Would you like me to play the recording? Richard's face went pale. Recording Aisha held up her phone. I've been documenting this entire incident, including conversations. It's amazing what people will say when they think there won't be consequences. Captain Mitchell's expression grew even more serious. Ms. Pierce, he said, turning to Madison, is this an accurate representation of events? Madison looked like a deer caught in headlights. She glanced around the cabin desperately, perhaps hoping someone would come to her defense, but found only uncomfortable silence. I was trying to maintain security, she stammered. Sometimes we get passengers who don't really belong in first class, and it's my responsibility to ensure that paying customers receive the service they deserve. And you determined that Ms. Thompson didn't deserve first-class service based on what criteria Captain Mitchell asked. Madison's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. How could she explain that she'd made her determination based on Aisha's clothing, her appearance, her race, without admitting to discrimination? She didn't seem like... Madison tried again, but couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Chen, who had been listening to this exchange with growing disapproval, finally spoke up. Captain, she said, her accented English clear and firm. I have been watching this situation since we boarded. This young lady has been polite, quiet, and respectful throughout the flight. The only disturbance has come from the way she has been treated by your crew member. Thank you, Mrs. Chen, Captain Mitchell said. Mr. Blackwood, do you have anything to add? Richard squirmed in his seat, clearly wishing he'd kept his mouth shut earlier. Look, I may have spoken out of turn. I was trying to be helpful. Madison seemed to be having some difficulty with the situation. The situation being that a paying passenger was requesting service. Captain Mitchell asked pointedly. Well, when you put it like that, how else would I put it? The captain's tone was growing colder, and Aisha could see that he was reaching the same conclusions she had hoped he would. This wasn't about security or proper procedures. This was about prejudice and discrimination, plain and simple. Ms. Pierce, Captain Mitchell said, returning his attention to Madison. Do you have any evidence to support your concerns about Ms. Thompson's ticket or payment method? No, sir, Madison whispered. Any reason to believe she posed a security threat? No, sir. Any justification for treating her differently than other passengers? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Madison looked around the cabin one more time, perhaps hoping for some miraculous reprieve, but found only faces filled with disapproval and disappointment. No, sir, she finally admitted. Captain Mitchell nodded grimly. Ms. Thompson, on behalf of Prestige Airways, I apologize for the treatment you've received on this flight. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed immediately. He turned to Madison. Ms. Pierce, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Please report to the crew rest area and remain there until we land. Madison's face crumpled. Captain, please. I've been with this airline for 8 years. I can't afford to lose this job. I was just trying to do what I thought was right. What you thought was right was denying service to a paying passenger based on how she looked, Captain Mitchell said flatly. That's not airline policy, Ms. Pierce. That's discrimination. The word hit like a physical blow. Madison staggered slightly, reaching out to steady herself against the nearest seat back. But she tried one more time. Enough, Captain Mitchell said firmly. This conversation is over. Madison looked at Aisha one last time, her eyes filled with desperation and something that might have been recognition of the gravity of her mistake. Miss Thompson, she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please, I'm begging you, don't let them ruin my life over this." Aisha studied her for a long moment, seeing not the confident, prejudiced flight attendant who had made her feel unwelcome, but a woman who had finally understood the consequences of her actions. "Madison," she said quietly, "you didn't just discriminate against me. You discriminated against everyone who looks like me. Everyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of who belongs in first class. You made it clear that in your world respect is something that has to be earned through appearance and status, not something that every human being deserves." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Your life isn't being ruined by me or by Captain Mitchell or by anyone else. Your life is being affected by choices you made, attitudes you held, and actions you took. If you want to fix your life, start by fixing the person who made those choices." Madison nodded through her tears, understanding perhaps for the first time that this wasn't just about losing a job. It was about confronting the ugliness in her own heart. As Captain Mitchell escorted Madison toward the crew area, Richard called out, "This is ridiculous. You can't ruin someone's career over a simple misunderstanding." Captain Mitchell stopped and turned back to face him. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice ice cold. "I've reviewed your frequent flyer account, and I've noticed a pattern of complaints about service when you fly with crew members who don't look like you. I've also noted your tendency to make disparaging comments about other passengers based on their appearance." Richard's face went white. "Those are isolated incidents taken out of context. Effective immediately, your Prestige Airways frequent flyer account is suspended pending a full review of your conduct. You'll be escorted off the aircraft by security when we land in London, and you'll receive written notice about the status of your future travel privileges with this airline." "You can't do that," Richard sputtered. "I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with this airline, and we'll be perfectly happy to lose that revenue if it means creating a better environment for passengers and crew who understand that respect isn't determined by the size of your bank account." As Captain Mitchell disappeared with Madison into the crew area, the cabin fell into a stunned silence. Emma stood by the galley looking shell-shocked but relieved while Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly at the captain's handling of the situation. Sarah, who had been trying to keep her baby quiet during the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. "Excuse me," she said to Aisha. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've had flight attendants treat me like garbage because I'm traveling with a baby, like I don't deserve to be in first class because children are inconvenient. What you just did, it helps all of us." Aisha smiled at her, the first genuine smile she'd felt since boarding the plane. "We all deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of how we look or what our circumstances are." Emma approached hesitantly. "Ms. Thompson, I want to apologize for not doing more to help earlier. I knew what Madison was doing was wrong, but I was scared of losing my job." "You did help," Aisha assured her, "and now you have a chance to help create a better culture on this airline." Emma nodded eagerly. "I want to do that. I want to make sure every passenger feels welcome regardless of who they are." As the plane continued its journey toward London, Aisha settled back into her seat, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The confrontation had been necessary, but it had also been draining. She had no idea that in a few hours she would need every bit of that energy to face an even greater challenge, one that would test not just her authority as the airline's owner, but her character as a human being. The plane flew on through the night, carrying them all toward a reckoning that was far from over. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted dramatically after Madison's removal. But the tension hadn't entirely dissipated. It had simply changed character, transforming from the ugly energy of discrimination and conflict into something more complex, a mixture of relief, curiosity, and anticipation of what might come next. Emma had stepped seamlessly into Madison's role, moving through the cabin with a professionalism and warmth that highlighted just how toxic Madison's presence had been. She served everyone with the same courtesy and attention to detail, offering Aisha the premium meal service she'd been denied, bringing fresh flowers for Mrs. Chen's tray table and even finding a small toy to keep Sarah's baby entertained. "This is how service should be," Mrs. Chen observed quietly as Emma refilled her teacup. Equal dignity for all passengers. Richard, meanwhile, had become a study in subdued anxiety. The swagger and casual cruelty he'd displayed earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who'd suddenly realized that actions have consequences, and that his behavior might have cost him more than just his pride. He kept glancing toward Aisha, clearly wanting to say something but lacking the courage to approach her directly. When Emma passed his seat, he grabbed her arm gently. "Excuse me," he said, his voice lacking its earlier arrogance. "That woman in 1A. Do you know who she is? I mean, really?" Emma looked at him with barely concealed distaste. "She's a passenger, Mr. Blackwood. Just like you." But the captain seemed to know her personally and the way he handled the situation. Maybe that's just how decent people respond when they see discrimination happening right in front of them, Emma replied coolly, pulling her arm free and continuing with her service. Aisha had been watching these interactions with interest while reviewing her notes from the flight. She had documented everything: Madison's behavior, Richard's comments, the reactions of other passengers, the captain's response. It would all be useful when she began implementing the changes she'd been planning. But first, she needed to address something that had been bothering her since Captain Mitchell's intervention. She pressed the call button, and Emma appeared almost immediately. "Yes, Ms. Thompson. Could you ask Captain Mitchell if he has a few minutes to speak with me? I'd like to thank him personally for his handling of the situation." Emma nodded and headed toward the cockpit. A few minutes later, Captain Mitchell emerged, looking somewhat more relaxed now that the immediate crisis had been resolved. "Ms. Thompson," he said, approaching her seat. "How are you feeling? I know that was a difficult situation." "I'm fine." "Captain, thank you. Actually, I wanted to commend you on your response. It showed real leadership and integrity." Captain Mitchell looked pleased, but slightly puzzled. "I appreciate that, but I was just doing my job. No passenger should have to endure what you experienced tonight." Aisha studied his face carefully. He was a good man, she could see that clearly, but there was something in his expression that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "Captain," she said quietly, "when I called you earlier, you didn't seem surprised to hear from me directly. Most passengers don't have the captain's personal number." Captain Mitchell's expression became more guarded. "We take security very seriously at Prestige Airways. When a passenger reports discriminatory treatment, we have protocols." "That's not what I mean, and I think you know it." They looked at each other for a long moment, and Aisha could see the moment when Captain Mitchell made a decision. "Ms. Thompson," he said, lowering his voice. "I received a confidential memo this morning about a VIP passenger on this flight, someone traveling incognito who was conducting an evaluation of our service standards." Aisha felt her heartbeat quicken. "I see." The memo didn't include a name or seat assignment, just instructions to be available for direct communication if needed, and to handle any situations with extra care and attention. He paused, studying her face. "When you called, using the emergency code that only company executives have access to, I began to suspect that you might be that VIP passenger." The conversation had reached a tipping point, and Aisha realized that her carefully maintained cover was about to be blown, whether she wanted it to be or not. She could try to continue the deception, but Captain Mitchell was clearly too intelligent and experienced to be fooled much longer. "You're very observant, Captain," she said finally. "It's part of the job. But I have to ask, who are you really? The emergency code you used is restricted to board members and senior executives." Aisha looked around the cabin, taking in the scene one more time. Emma was serving coffee to Mrs. Chen, who was reading her book again. Sarah was successfully getting her baby to sleep. Richard was staring out the window, lost in what were probably very uncomfortable thoughts about his future with the airline. It had been a perfect test of the airline's culture, revealing exactly the problems she'd suspected existed. Now it was time to reveal who she really was and begin the process of fixing those problems. "Captain Mitchell," she said, "I think we should have this conversation somewhere more private. Is there somewhere we can talk without disturbing the other passengers?" He nodded. "There's a small crew office just behind the cockpit. We can speak there." As they stood up, Richard finally found his courage. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice shaky. "I just wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. It was inappropriate and I'm sorry." Aisha turned to look at him, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes for the first time that evening. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Blackwood. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." "I was very wrong," he said, "and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." "Forgiveness is something you give yourself through changed behavior," Aisha replied gently. "I hope you'll remember this experience the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance." Richard nodded, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. Aisha followed Captain Mitchell to the small crew office, a cramped space with a desk, 2 chairs, and walls covered with safety protocols and flight information. When he closed the door behind them, the noise of the aircraft engines became more pronounced, creating a cocoon of privacy around their conversation. Captain Aisha said, settling into one of the chairs, "Before I explain who I am, I want you to know that everything you did tonight was exactly right. Your response to the discrimination I experienced was professional, decisive, and moral. You should be proud of how you handled the situation." Captain Mitchell looked both pleased and nervous. "Thank you, but I have to admit I'm very curious about who I'm really speaking with." Aisha reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone, opening an email from her legal team that contained all the documentation of the airline acquisition. "My name is Aisha Thompson," she said, turning the phone so he could see the screen. "As of this morning, I am the sole owner and chairwoman of Prestige Airways." Captain Mitchell stared at the screen for a long moment, his eyes widening as he processed the information. Then he looked at Aisha, really looked at her, seeing past the hoodie and the casual appearance to the intelligence and determination that had built a $4 billion empire. "You're the Vital Link founder," he said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The healthcare app that revolutionized patient monitoring." "Among other things, yes. And you bought the entire airline." "I did." Captain Mitchell sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "May I ask why?" Aisha smiled for the first time in what felt like hours. "Because I wanted to see how my employees treated customers when they thought no one important was watching. And because I wanted to change an industry that has forgotten that service means serving everyone, not just the people who look like they belong." The captain was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications of what she'd told him. "So Madison discriminated against the owner of the airline," he said finally. "Madison discriminated against a human being," Aisha corrected. "The fact that I happen to own the airline is irrelevant to the moral dimension of what she did. It's only relevant to my ability to make sure it doesn't happen again." Captain Mitchell nodded slowly. "What happens now? Now we land in London. We deal with the immediate consequences of tonight's events, and then we begin the process of building a better airline. One where every passenger is treated with dignity, where every employee understands that respect isn't determined by appearance or status, and where discrimination has no place in our culture." She paused, studying his face. "I'm going to need allies in that effort, Captain. People with integrity and leadership skills who can help transform this company from the inside out. Are you interested in being part of that change?" Captain Mitchell didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. This industry has tolerated discrimination for too long, hiding behind policies and procedures that allow bias to flourish. If you're serious about changing that culture, you have my complete support." "Good," Aisha said. Because what happened tonight was just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do." As they prepared to return to the cabin, Captain Mitchell turned to her with one more question. "Ms. Thompson, if you don't mind me asking, why the disguise? Why not just announce who you were from the beginning?" Aisha thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because privilege can be blinding, Captain. When people know you have power, they show you the face they want you to see, not their true character. I needed to see how my employees really behaved when they thought they could get away with it." She stood up, smoothing down her hoodie. "And now I know exactly what needs to be fixed." They had been flying smoothly over the North Atlantic for another hour when the first signs of trouble began to manifest, starting as a subtle vibration that most passengers probably attributed to normal turbulence, but which Captain Mitchell recognized immediately as something more serious. Aisha was back in her seat, having spent the time since their private conversation reviewing employee files on her laptop and making notes about the changes she wanted to implement throughout the airline's corporate structure when she felt the aircraft's rhythm change. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a slight irregularity in the engine noise, a barely perceptible shift in the plane's attitude that made her look up from her screen with the instinctive alertness of someone who had spent years paying attention to details that others missed. Emma was in the galley cleaning up from the dinner service when the first real jolt hit the plane. It wasn't the smooth rise and fall of ordinary turbulence, but a sharp jarring motion that sent glasses sliding across tray tables and caused several passengers to grip their armrests instinctively. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom. His tone calm but carrying an undertone of concern that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. "We're experiencing some mechanical turbulence due to a hydraulic pressure warning. As a precaution, we're going to be descending to a lower altitude and diverting to London Heathrow for an early landing. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The announcement created an immediate shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Mrs. Chen closed her book and gripped the arms of her seat, her knuckles turning white. Sarah pulled her baby closer, whispering soft reassurances that seemed intended as much for herself as for her child. Richard looked genuinely frightened for the first time since Aisha had observed him, all his earlier arrogance replaced by the universal human fear of being helpless in a metal tube 7 miles above the ocean. Emma moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, checking that everyone's seatbelts were secure, but Aisha could see the worry in her eyes. This was her first real emergency as a flight attendant, and the weight of responsibility for passenger safety was clearly overwhelming. Then, the real turbulence hit. It started as a series of sharp jolts that made the aircraft feel like it was driving over railroad tracks at high speed, but quickly escalated into something far more violent. The plane suddenly dropped what felt like 100 feet, creating that terrifying moment of weightlessness, where everyone's stomach rose into their throat and loose objects briefly floated in midair before crashing back down. The sound that accompanied the drop was like nothing Aisha had ever heard, a combination of straining metal howling wind and the deep, irregular rumble of engines working harder than they were designed to work. Oh God, we're going to die," Sarah moaned, clutching her baby so tightly that the child began to cry. Mrs. Chen was praying quietly in what sounded like Mandarin, her lips moving rapidly as she stared straight ahead with the focused concentration of someone trying to maintain control through sheer force of will. Richard had gone completely white, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone, probably trying to send what he thought might be final messages to his family. Emma was pressed against the galley wall, trying to maintain her footing as the aircraft continued to shake and lurch unpredictably. She was clearly terrified, but fighting to maintain her professional composure, knowing that passenger panic would only make the situation worse. Aisha unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated," Emma called out over the noise of the struggling engines. "Someone's going to get hurt if this keeps up," Aisha replied, making her way carefully toward the galley where the serving carts were stored. "We need to secure these carts before they break loose." As if summoned by her words, another violent jolt sent the aircraft tilting sharply to the left, and one of the heavy metal serving carts that hadn't been properly secured broke free from its restraints and began rolling down the aisle toward the passenger seats. The cart was loaded with glasses, bottles, and metal serving implements, turning it into a 100-pound projectile that could seriously injure or kill anyone in its path. It was heading directly toward Mrs. Chen's seat. Aisha didn't think she just acted, launching herself across the tilting cabin floor and throwing her body against the runaway cart just as it reached row 3. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent sharp pain shooting through her shoulder, but she managed to stop the cart's momentum and pin it against the seat back. "Emma," she called out, "help me get this thing secured." Emma pushed off from the galley wall and half-crawled, half-slid down the aisle to where Aisha was wrestling with the cart. Together they managed to maneuver it back toward the galley and engage the proper restraints, working together with the kind of instinctive teamwork that emerges in crisis situations. "Thank you," Mrs. Chen said breathlessly when they finished. "That cart would have—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what would have happened. The aircraft's violent motion was beginning to subside slightly, but they weren't out of danger yet. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom again, and this time there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have confirmed hydraulic system failure and are executing an emergency descent to London Heathrow. Emergency crews will be standing by when we land. Please review the safety card in your seat pocket and listen carefully to instructions from the cabin crew." Emma was back on her feet now, moving through the cabin to check on passengers and provide reassurance, but Aisha could see that she was struggling with the scope of the emergency. She was young, inexperienced, and dealing with mechanical problems that went far beyond anything her training had prepared her for. Sarah's baby was screaming now, feeding off his mother's terror and adding his own panic to the already tense atmosphere in the cabin. Aisha called out, "Do you have any experience with emergency evacuations?" "Only in training," Emma replied, her voice tight with stress. Aisha made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a few hours earlier when she had been focused on maintaining her cover as an ordinary passenger. "Mrs. Chen," she said, addressing the elderly woman directly, "you've been very calm throughout this emergency. Can you help Sarah with her baby? She needs someone steady to keep her grounded." Mrs. Chen unbuckled her seatbelt and moved to Sarah's row, immediately taking charge with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of life experience. "Young lady," she said to Sarah, "your baby needs you to be calm. Here, let me show you a breathing technique that will help both of you." Aisha turned to Richard, who was still fumbling with his phone with shaking hands. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to put your phone away and help Emma check the emergency exits. Make sure the paths are clear and that everyone knows where their nearest exit is located." Richard looked up at her with confusion and fear. "I don't know anything about emergency procedures." "You don't need to know anything except how to look and how to count," Aisha said firmly. "Emma will tell you what to check for. Right now we all need to work together." There was something in her voice, an authority and confidence that seemed to cut through the panic that made Richard nod and follow her instructions without further argument. Emma looked at Aisha with amazement. "How do you know so much about emergency procedures? I used to work in hospitality," Aisha said, which was true as far as it went. "You learn to manage crisis situations when you're responsible for other people's safety and comfort." What she didn't mention was that as the owner of a technology company, she had also completed extensive training in crisis management and emergency leadership skills that were proving invaluable in their current situation. The aircraft was descending rapidly now, the pressure changes making everyone's ears pop as Captain Mitchell worked to get them to an altitude where the damaged hydraulic systems would be less critical to their survival. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice came over the intercom one more time, "we will be landing at London Heathrow in approximately 15 minutes. The landing may be rougher than usual due to our hydraulic problems, but the aircraft is stable and controllable. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and listen to your cabin crew for further instructions. Emma was moving through the cabin now with renewed confidence, her natural competence enhanced by Aisha's calm leadership and the assistance of the other passengers. Mrs. Chen had successfully calmed Sarah and her baby. Richard was methodically checking emergency equipment despite his obvious fear, and even the cabin atmosphere had improved as everyone focused on working together rather than panicking individually. Aisha returned to her seat and buckled her seatbelt, but her mind was racing with thoughts that had nothing to do with their current emergency. She had just witnessed something remarkable when faced with a real crisis. The artificial barriers and prejudices that had seemed so important earlier in the flight had evaporated completely. Mrs. Chen had helped Sarah without considering their differences in age or background. Emma had accepted Aisha's leadership without questioning her authority or her right to take charge. Even Richard had put aside his earlier behavior to contribute to their collective safety. It was a powerful reminder of what human beings were capable of when they focused on what united them rather than what divided them, and it gave her hope for the changes she wanted to make at Prestige Airways. The plane began its final approach to Heathrow, and through the windows Aisha could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles already positioned along the runway ready to respond if the damaged aircraft had trouble stopping or if an evacuation became necessary. But as they descended toward the lights of London, she realized that the real emergency, the crisis of discrimination and dehumanization that had brought her onto this flight in the first place, was far from over. The mechanical problems they'd just survived were nothing compared to the cultural problems she still had to fix. The emergency landing at Heathrow was rough, but successful, with Captain Mitchell using his decades of experience to bring the damaged aircraft down safely, despite the hydraulic problems that had plagued the final hour of their flight. As the plane rolled to a stop on the runway surrounded by emergency vehicles, with their lights flashing in the pre-dawn London darkness, Aisha felt a mixture of relief at their safe arrival and anticipation of what would come next. The immediate priority was ensuring that all passengers were safe and accounted for, but she knew that the events of the flight, both the discrimination incident and the emergency that had followed, would have consequences that extended far beyond their arrival in London. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Mitchell announced over the intercom, "we have landed safely at London Heathrow. Please remain seated while emergency personnel board the aircraft to conduct a safety check. We will begin deplaning shortly, and ground crew will be available to assist with any immediate needs." The first responders who boarded the plane were efficient and professional, quickly determining that no one had been injured during the emergency and that the aircraft was stable and safe for normal deplaning procedures. But they weren't the only officials waiting to board the aircraft. As the emergency personnel completed their checks and began to leave, Aisha saw 2 uniformed police officers waiting at the jet bridge, along with several people in business attire, who were clearly airline executives summoned to deal with the situation that had developed during the flight. Emma, who had performed admirably during the emergency and earned the respect of every passenger in first class, approached Aisha's seat with obvious nervousness. "Ms. Thompson," she said quietly, "there are some people here who want to speak with you about what happened earlier. I think they might want statements about Madison's behavior." Aisha nodded, having expected this development. The discrimination incident had been serious enough on its own, but combined with the emergency landing and the irregularities in how the situation had been handled, it would require thorough investigation and documentation. "That's fine, Emma. I'm prepared to discuss everything that happened." She stood up and gathered her belongings, noting that the other passengers were also preparing to leave, though she could see curiosity and concern in their faces as they observed the unusual number of officials waiting to board. Richard Blackwood was among the first to approach her as they prepared to deplane. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice still shaky from the emergency landing, "I wanted to thank you for your leadership during the crisis. You probably saved lives with your quick thinking." He paused, looking genuinely remorseful. "And I wanted to apologize again for my behavior earlier. Watching you take charge during the emergency made me realize how completely wrong I was about you and how ugly my assumptions were. Aisha studied his face, seeing what appeared to be genuine regret and recognition of the gravity of his earlier actions. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your apology. What matters now is whether this experience changes how you treat people in the future. It will, he said firmly. I promise you it will. Mrs. Chen approached next, moving with the same quiet dignity she had displayed throughout the entire flight. Young lady, she said to Aisha, I have been traveling for many decades, and I have seen both the best and worst of human behavior. What you did tonight, both standing up to discrimination and leading us through the emergency, showed real character. She paused, looking directly into Aisha's eyes. I hope you understand that people like me see what happens on flights like this, and we remember. We talk to our friends, our families, our communities about airlines that treat people well and airlines that don't. Tonight will be remembered. Sarah, still holding her now sleeping baby, was the last to speak. I don't know who you are, she said softly, but thank you. Thank you for not letting them treat you badly, and thank you for helping all of us when things got scary. My son is too young to understand what happened tonight, but someday I'll tell him about the woman who stood up for herself and then took care of everyone else. As the passengers began to deplane, Aisha was approached by one of the police officers, a professional-looking woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Inspector Sarah Collins. Miss Thompson, she said. I'm Inspector Collins with the Metropolitan Police. I understand there was an incident during the flight that we need to discuss. Yes, that's correct. We'll need to conduct formal interviews with all the parties involved, but I wanted to let you know that we've already spoken with Captain Mitchell, and he's provided us with a preliminary report of the events. Inspector Collins looked around the now empty first-class cabin, taking in the scene where the discrimination had occurred. I also understand that you may have recorded portions of the incident I did, Aisha confirmed. I documented the discriminatory treatment extensively, including audio recordings of conversations and photographs of the differential service I received. That will be very helpful for our investigation. We take discrimination complaints seriously, particularly when they occur in commercial aviation where passengers have limited options for removing themselves from hostile situations. One of the airline executives, a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit, stepped forward and introduced himself as David Harrison, Vice President of Customer Relations for Prestige Airways. Ms. Thompson, he said, his voice carefully controlled on behalf of Prestige Airways, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received on this flight. This behavior is completely contrary to our company values and policies. Aisha looked at him with interest, wondering how his tone might change when he learned who she really was. Mr. Harrison, she said, I appreciate your apology, but I think we need to have a more comprehensive discussion about your company's culture and practices. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the predictable result of attitudes and behaviors that have been allowed to flourish throughout your organization. Harrison looked uncomfortable but nodded. Of course, we take these concerns very seriously. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting at our London offices to discuss your experience in detail and how we can prevent similar incidents in the future. I think that would be very helpful, Aisha agreed. In fact, I think we have a lot to discuss about the future of Prestige Airways. As they spoke, Emma was being interviewed by one of the other police officers, providing her account of Madison's behavior and the discriminatory treatment she had witnessed and been instructed to participate in. Aisha could hear fragments of Emma's statement. She told me not to waste the good service on Ms. Thompson. She said she didn't belong in first class. She made me serve tap water while other passengers got bottled water. Each statement was another nail in the coffin of Madison's career and another piece of evidence in the case that would need to be built to ensure that real changes were made throughout the airline. Inspector Collins returned her attention to Aisha. Thompson, we'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to provide a formal statement. but I wanted you to know that based on the preliminary evidence and witness statements, we'll be filing charges against the flight attendant for discrimination and harassment." "What kind of charges?" Aisha asked. "Under the Equality Act 2010, discrimination in the provision of services based on race or ethnicity is a serious offense. Combined with the harassment and the hostile environment that was created, we're looking at both criminal charges and civil violations." She paused, consulting her notes. "We're also investigating the passenger who made the accusatory statements about stolen credit cards and fraudulent tickets. That could constitute defamation and harassment as well." As the official interviews continued and the investigation began in earnest, Aisha felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that the system was working, that the discrimination she had experienced was being taken seriously and would have real consequences. But sadness that it had come to this, that it had taken legal action and criminal charges to address behavior that should never have been tolerated in the first place. But she also felt something else: determination. This incident would become a catalyst for the changes she had been planning to implement throughout Prestige Airways. The discrimination she had experienced and the courage she had shown in confronting it would become the foundation for building a better airline, one where every passenger was treated with dignity and every employee understood that respect was not conditional on appearance or status. As she prepared to leave the aircraft for the final time as an anonymous passenger, Aisha looked around the first-class cabin where so much had happened in such a short time. Tomorrow she would return as the owner of the airline, and the real work of transformation would begin. But tonight, justice was being served, and that was a start. The Prestige Airways corporate office in London's financial district was a gleaming tower of steel and glass that seemed designed to project power and success. But as Aisha rode the elevator to the 32nd floor executive conference room, she couldn't help but think about how superficial that impression really was. 3 days had passed since the flight. 3 days during which the story had exploded across social media and international news outlets, transforming what had started as a personal experience of discrimination into a global conversation about racism in the travel industry and corporate accountability. #Prestige Airways and #Justice. At 35,000 feet, we're trending worldwide with passengers sharing their own stories of discriminatory treatment by airline staff, while customer service advocates and civil rights organizations called for broader investigations into industry practices. The legal proceedings were moving forward as well. Madison Pierce had been formally charged with discrimination and harassment, while Richard Blackwood faced civil litigation for defamation. But more importantly, from Aisha's perspective, the incident had created the perfect opportunity to implement the sweeping changes she had been planning since acquiring the airline. David Harrison, the vice president of customer relations she had met at Heathrow, was waiting in the conference room along with several other senior executives, all of whom looked nervous and uncertain about what kind of legal and financial consequences the incident might have for the company. "Mrs. Thompson," Harrison said as she entered the room, "thank you for meeting with us today. We want to assure you that Prestige Airways takes your experience very seriously, and we're committed to making whatever changes are necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future." Aisha took a seat at the head of the conference table, setting down her laptop and the same battered backpack she had carried on the flight, enjoying the slightly confused looks the executives gave each other as they tried to reconcile her casual appearance with the authority she seemed to command in the room. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "I appreciate your commitment to change, but I think there might be some confusion about the nature of this meeting." She opened her laptop and pulled up the acquisition documents that had been finalized just hours before her flight. "I'm not here as a discrimination victim seeking compensation or policy changes from your company," she said, turning the screen so everyone in the room could see it clearly. "I'm here as the owner and chairwoman of Prestige Airways, and we're here to discuss how we're going to rebuild this airline from the ground up." The silence that followed was profound and absolute. Harrison stared at the screen for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching panic as he processed what he was seeing. You're Aisha Thompson, he said finally. The Vital Link founder. I am. And you own the entire airline as of last Monday morning. The incident on Flight 447 wasn't a random case of discrimination. It was a test of our company culture, and we failed that test spectacularly. The other executives looked like they wanted to disappear into their leather chairs. The woman they had been prepared to offer vouchers and apologies to was actually their new boss, and she had experienced firsthand the ugliest aspects of their organizational culture. Ms. Thompson Harrison said, his voice shaking slightly, "We had no idea. If we had known you were evaluating the service—" "That's exactly the point," Aisha interrupted. "The service shouldn't change based on who's watching. Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of how they look or how much money the staff thinks they have." She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking London, gathering her thoughts before continuing. What happened on that flight wasn't an anomaly. It was the predictable result of a corporate culture that has allowed discrimination to flourish under the guise of customer service standards. Madison Pierce didn't invent her prejudices in a vacuum. She learned them from training policies and examples that taught her that some passengers matter more than others. She turned back to face the room. "We're going to change all of that starting today." Over the next several hours, Aisha outlined a comprehensive transformation plan that addressed every aspect of the airline's operations. New hiring practices that prioritized character and empathy over appearance and connections. Revised training programs that emphasized equal treatment for all passengers and included extensive anti-discrimination education. Updated service protocols that eliminated the subjective judgments that had allowed bias to influence passenger treatment. But the changes went deeper than policies and procedures. Aisha announced the creation of a passenger advocate program with Emma Rodriguez as the director, giving passengers a direct channel to report discriminatory treatment and ensuring that complaints would be investigated thoroughly and transparently. She also announced a community outreach initiative that would partner with civil rights organizations and community groups to rebuild trust with passengers who had been driven away by discriminatory treatment, and a scholarship program for young people from underserved communities who were interested in aviation careers. The airline industry has a long history of discrimination, she told the assembled executives, but it also has the potential to be a force for positive change in the world. Every day we transport people across borders and between cultures, connecting families and enabling opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. She paused, looking each executive in the eye. "We're going to be an airline that lives up to that potential, one that treats every passenger like they matter because they do." The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, and there would undoubtedly be resistance from employees and systems that had grown comfortable with the status quo. But Aisha had the power to enforce change, the resources to support it, and the moral authority that came from having experienced the problems firsthand. As the meeting concluded and the executives filed out to begin implementing the new policies, Harrison approached her with obvious nervousness. "Ms. Thompson," he said, "I want you to know that I personally never supported the kind of treatment you experienced on Flight 447, and I'm committed to helping you create the changes you've outlined." Aisha studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity or opportunism. "Mr. Harrison, I believe you probably are personally opposed to overt discrimination, but I also believe you've been part of a system that allowed it to flourish through benign neglect and willful blindness." She gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. "The question now is whether you're willing to be part of the solution, even when it means confronting uncomfortable truths about the culture you helped create." As she left the London office and stepped into the busy streets of the financial district, Aisha felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The real work was just beginning, but she had taken the first crucial steps toward building the airline she envisioned, one where her mother could have traveled with dignity, where young people like Emma could build careers based on merit rather than connections, and where no passenger would ever again be made to feel unwelcome because of who they were or how they looked. The transformation of Prestige Airways had begun, and it would serve as a model for how other companies could address discrimination and build more inclusive cultures. But first, she had a promise to keep to someone who had shown courage when it mattered most. 6 months after the incident on Flight 447, Emma Rodriguez stood in the main terminal of JFK International Airport wearing the crisp uniform of a Prestige Airways customer service director and carrying herself with the confident professionalism of someone who had found her calling. The terminal was bustling with the usual chaos of international travel, but there was something different about the atmosphere around the Prestige Airways gates, a warmth and efficiency that passengers noticed and commented on, a sense that the staff genuinely cared about providing excellent service to everyone, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. Emma was conducting one of her regular passenger experience audits, observing how customers were treated at every stage of their journey and ensuring that the new service standards Aisha had implemented were being followed consistently. She watched as a gate agent helped an elderly passenger who was struggling with the check-in kiosk, patiently explaining each step and ensuring he felt comfortable with the process. She observed a flight attendant greeting each passenger with genuine warmth as they boarded, making eye contact and offering assistance without the subtle discrimination that had once been commonplace. These changes hadn't happened automatically. The transformation of Prestige Airways had required months of intensive training, policy revisions, and personnel changes as employees who couldn't or wouldn't adapt to the new culture were replaced by people who embraced the values of dignity and respect that Aisha had made central to the airline's mission. Some of the resistance had come from surprising places, veteran employees who had been with the company for years and couldn't understand why service standards that had seemed acceptable were suddenly being criticized. Passengers who complained that they weren't receiving the special treatment. They felt their elite status entitled them to even industry analysts who questioned whether an airline could remain profitable while treating all customers equally. But the results spoke for themselves. Customer satisfaction scores had risen dramatically across all demographics, with particular improvements in ratings from passengers who had previously felt unwelcome or marginalized. Employee morale was at an all-time high, as staff members found greater job satisfaction in providing genuinely helpful service, rather than navigating the complex hierarchy of preferential treatment that had previously defined their roles. Perhaps most importantly, the airline was attracting new customers, families, young professionals, international travelers who had heard about Prestige Airways' commitment to equal treatment and wanted to support a company that aligned with their values. Emma's radio crackled to life. "Director Rodriguez, we have a situation at Gate 12 that requires your attention." She made her way quickly through the terminal, preparing for whatever challenge awaited. In her new role, she had handled everything from passenger complaints to medical emergencies, each situation an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership and customer care that Aisha had envisioned when she created the Passenger Advocate Program. At Gate 12, she found a scene that would have been familiar 6 months earlier, but was now rare enough to be noteworthy. A passenger was raising his voice at a gate agent demanding special treatment that he felt his frequent flyer status entitled him to. "I've been flying first class with this airline for 15 years, the man was saying, his voice carrying across the gate area. "And I don't appreciate being treated like some economy passenger. I expect my usual upgrades, my preferred seating, and the level of service that I've earned." The gate agent, a young man named Marcus who had been hired as part of Aisha's diversity initiative, was handling the situation with remarkable composure. "Sir, I understand your frustration, and I appreciate your loyalty to Prestige Airways. I'm happy to review your reservation and see what options are available, but I want to make sure I understand what specific service you feel you're not receiving." Emma approached the counter. her presence immediately changing the dynamic of the interaction. "Good afternoon," she said pleasantly. "I'm Emma Rodriguez, Director of Passenger Experience. How can I help resolve this situation?" The passenger turned to her with obvious relief, apparently assuming that someone with a title would be more likely to give him what he wanted. "Finally, someone with authority," he said. "This agent doesn't seem to understand how frequent flyer programs work. I'm a Diamond Elite member, and I expect to be treated accordingly." Emma checked his record on the computer terminal, noting his frequent flyer status, as well as several complaints in his file about demanding special treatment and making disparaging comments about other passengers. "Mr. Patterson, she said I see that you are indeed a valued frequent flyer, and we appreciate your business with Prestige Airways. Marcus here is one of our most experienced agents, and I'm confident he can help you with whatever specific needs you have." She paused, looking him directly in the eye. "However, I want to make sure you understand that our commitment to excellent service means providing that service to all of our passengers equally. Your frequent flyer status entitles you to the benefits outlined in our program, but it doesn't entitle you to treatment that comes at the expense of other passengers' dignity or comfort." Patterson's face flushed red. "Are you telling me that my years of loyalty don't matter? That I should be treated the same as someone flying on a discount ticket? I'm telling you that every passenger deserves to be treated with courtesy and respect," Emma replied calmly. "Your loyalty matters and we value it, but not more than we value our commitment to creating a welcoming environment for everyone who flies with us." The confrontation could have escalated, but something in Emma's tone, firm but not confrontational, clear about boundaries but not dismissive, seemed to diffuse Patterson's anger. "Look," he said, his voice calmer, "I just want the service I've come to expect. I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone else." "I understand," Emma said. "Marcus, why don't you review Mr. Patterson's options for today's flight and see if we can address his specific concerns?" As Marcus worked to find solutions that met Patterson's needs without compromising the airline's values, Emma reflected on how different this interaction was from what would have happened 6 months earlier. Under the old culture, Patterson's demands would likely have been met immediately, regardless of how his preferential treatment affected other passengers or staff members. Gate agents would have been pressured to accommodate his sense of entitlement, creating a toxic dynamic that reinforced the idea that some people mattered more than others. Now the airline had found a way to recognize loyalty and provide excellent service while maintaining the principle that all passengers deserved equal dignity and respect. Her radio crackled again. "Director Rodriguez, Ms. Thompson is here for her monthly passenger experience review." Emma smiled, still feeling a thrill of pride whenever she heard Aisha's name. The woman who had endured discrimination with such grace and courage had become not just her boss, but her mentor, teaching her that true leadership meant standing up for principles even when it was difficult or costly. She made her way to the Prestige Airways executive lounge, where Aisha was waiting with her usual laptop and notepad, ready to review the latest customer feedback and discuss ongoing improvements to the airline's service culture. Emma Aisha said warmly as she approached, "How are things going today?" "Really well," Emma replied. "We had a minor situation with a passenger who was testing our boundaries around equal treatment, but Marcus handled it perfectly, and I think we found a resolution that honored both our values and the passenger's legitimate needs." Aisha nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of balance we're trying to achieve. How are the staff adapting to the new standards?" "Most of them are thriving," Emma said. "There's something energizing about being part of a company that stands for something positive that makes employees proud of the service they provide." They spent the next hour reviewing passenger feedback, employee surveys, and operational metrics, tracking the progress of the airline's transformation and identifying areas that still needed improvement. But perhaps the most meaningful part of their conversation came at the end when Aisha asked Emma about her own experience leading the passenger advocate program. "6 months ago, you were afraid to speak up when you saw discrimination happening," Aisha said. Now you're leading the effort to ensure it never happens again. How does that feel? Emma considered the question carefully before answering. It feels like I finally found my purpose, she said. All my life I've seen people treated unfairly because of how they looked or where they came from, and I always wished I could do something about it, but didn't know how. She paused, looking out at the bustling terminal where passengers of all backgrounds were being served with equal care and attention. Now I get to spend every day making sure that people are treated the way they deserve to be treated, and I get to work for a company that supports that mission instead of undermining it. Aisha smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that positive change is not only possible but sustainable. The transformation of Prestige Airways was succeeding, but more than that, it was proving that businesses could be profitable while maintaining strong ethical standards, and that treating people with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do, it was also good business. 1 year after Flight 447, Aisha Thompson found herself back at JFK International Airport preparing to board another Prestige Airways flight to London. But this time, everything was different. She was traveling openly as the airline's owner and chairwoman, her presence announced by the respectful attention of staff members who had come to understand that her leadership was based not on demanding special treatment, but on ensuring that everyone received the respect they deserved. But more importantly, she was traveling on an airline that had been fundamentally transformed from the inside out, a company that had become a model for how organizations could address discrimination and build inclusive cultures that served all customers equally. The gate area was buzzing with the positive energy that had become characteristic of Prestige Airways operations, with staff members who genuinely enjoyed their work and passengers who felt welcomed and valued regardless of their background or appearance. Emma Rodriguez, now the company's vice president of customer experience, was at the gate to see her off, having grown from a nervous junior flight attendant into one of the most respected leaders in the aviation industry. Everything ready for the London meetings, Emma asked, referring to the International Conference on Diversity in Aviation that Aisha was scheduled to address, sharing Prestige Airways' transformation story with airline executives from around the world. As ready as I can be, Aisha replied. It's still surreal sometimes thinking about how much has changed in just 1 year. The changes had been dramatic and wide-ranging. Prestige Airways now had the highest customer satisfaction ratings in the industry, with particular strength in ratings from passengers who had previously felt marginalized or unwelcome on other airlines. Employee retention was up significantly as staff members found greater job satisfaction in providing genuinely inclusive service. The airline's financial performance had improved, as well as the positive culture attracted customers who were willing to pay a premium to fly with a company that aligned with their values, while the elimination of discriminatory practices had reduced legal costs and improved operational efficiency. But perhaps most meaningfully, Prestige Airways had become a catalyst for change throughout the aviation industry, with other airlines studying their transformation model and implementing similar initiatives to address discrimination and improve service culture. As Aisha prepared to board, she was approached by an elderly woman who looked familiar, though it took her a moment to recognize Mrs. Chen, the passenger who had spoken up during the discrimination incident a year earlier. "Ms. Thompson," Mrs. Chen said with a warm smile, "what a pleasant surprise to see you again." "Mrs. Chen, how wonderful to see you. Are you traveling to London as well?" "Yes, visiting my grandchildren again. But I wanted to tell you how much I've enjoyed flying Prestige Airways since you made those changes. The service is excellent, and more importantly, everyone is treated with dignity." She paused, looking around the gate area with obvious satisfaction. "My granddaughter is starting college next year, and she wants to study business. I've been telling her about what you did, how you used your success to make things better for other people. She says you're her inspiration for the kind of leader she wants to become." The comment touched Aisha deeply, reminding her that the changes they'd made extended far beyond airline operations to influence young people's understanding of what ethical leadership could look like. As they boarded the aircraft, Aisha noticed immediately how different the experience was from that fateful flight a year ago. The flight attendants greeted every passenger warmly, making genuine eye contact and offering assistance without the subtle discrimination that had once been commonplace. The crew was notably diverse, reflecting the company's new commitment to inclusive hiring practices that prioritized character and competence over appearance or connections. Young people from various backgrounds were building careers based on merit and dedication, rather than having to navigate prejudice and favoritism. Her seat was in first class again, but this time she was accompanied by other passengers who represented the full spectrum of humanity: business travelers and families, young and old people of all races and backgrounds who had chosen Prestige Airways because they knew they would be treated well. Emma had arranged for Aisha to meet the flight's captain before takeoff, and she was pleased to discover that it was Captain Mitchell who had shown such integrity during the original incident and had since been promoted to chief pilot for the airline's Atlantic routes. "Ms. Thompson," he said as he greeted her in the boarding area, "it's an honor to have you flying with us today. I wanted you to know that the culture you've created throughout the company has made this the most rewarding job of my 30-year aviation career." "Captain Mitchell, the culture we created together," Aisha corrected. "Your leadership during that incident was crucial to everything that came after." As the flight progressed, Aisha had the opportunity to observe the service culture firsthand, watching as the flight attendants provided attentive professional service to all passengers equally. There were no subtle hierarchies, no preferential treatment based on appearance or perceived status, just consistent excellence that made everyone feel valued and respected. During the meal service, she was approached by a young flight attendant. She didn't recognize a woman about Emma's age who carried herself with the same quiet confidence that had made Emma such an effective leader. "Ms. Thompson," the flight attendant said, "I'm Jessica Williams. I wanted to thank you personally for the opportunities you've created at this company. I'm a recent graduate from the aviation program at Howard University, and Prestige Airways was the only airline that recruited at our job fair." She paused, looking genuinely grateful. "Your scholarship program paid for my flight training, and your commitment to inclusive hiring gave me a chance to build a career in aviation. I know I'm not the only one. There are dozens of young people from underserved communities who now have opportunities that didn't exist before you bought this airline." The conversation reminded Aisha that the transformation of Prestige Airways had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the company itself, opening doors for young people who might otherwise have been excluded from aviation careers, and creating a new generation of leaders who understood the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. As the flight neared London, Aisha reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. A year ago, she had been a successful entrepreneur who wanted to use her wealth and influence to address discrimination in the airline industry. She had expected to find problems and had been prepared to confront them, but she hadn't anticipated how personally challenging and ultimately rewarding the process would be. The discrimination she had experienced had been painful and infuriating, but it had also provided the motivation and moral authority needed to drive comprehensive change throughout the organization. The courage she had shown in confronting that discrimination had inspired employees like Emma to find their own voices and become advocates for positive change. Most importantly, the transformation of Prestige Airways had proven that it was possible to build a successful business based on principles of equality and respect, challenging the notion that companies had to choose between profitability and social responsibility. As Captain Mitchell announced their final approach to Heathrow, Aisha looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the scene of passengers from all walks of life being served with equal care and attention by a diverse crew of professionals who genuinely enjoyed their work. It was exactly what she had envisioned when she first decided to buy the airline, but it was also more than she had dared to hope for. Proof that positive change was not only possible but sustainable, and that treating people with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do. It was also the foundation for building something truly excellent. The plane touched down smoothly at Heathrow, completing another successful flight for an airline that had been transformed by the simple but powerful idea that everyone deserves to be treated with respect. As Aisha prepared to disembark and address the international conference that would share Prestige Airways' transformation story with aviation leaders around the world, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. The work was far from finished. There were still challenges to address, improvements to make, and barriers to overcome. But the foundation had been built, the culture had been changed, and the example had been set for how organizations could address discrimination and build inclusive environments that served everyone well. 1 year after a single slap exposed the rotten heart of an airline's culture, Aisha Thompson had proven that change was not only possible, but profitable, transforming Prestige Airways from a company that tolerated discrimination into an industry leader in inclusive service excellence. The young flight attendant, who had once been afraid to speak up against injustice, now led a team of professionals who understood that true service meant treating every passenger with equal dignity, while the elderly woman who had found the courage to call out discrimination had become a symbol of how ordinary people could stand up for what was right and create extraordinary change. Emma Rodriguez, who had grown from a terrified junior employee into a respected executive, now traveled the world, sharing Prestige Airways' transformation story and helping other companies understand that diversity wasn't just a moral imperative, but a business advantage that created stronger, more resilient organizations. Her success proved that when people are given the opportunity to lead with their values, they can achieve things that seemed impossible under the old systems of favoritism and prejudice. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Flight 447 was the hundreds of young people who now had opportunities in aviation careers, because Aisha had chosen to use her wealth and influence to open doors, rather than simply accumulate more power, demonstrating that true success meant creating pathways for others to achieve their dreams, while building a world where no one would ever again be made to feel small because of how they looked or where they came from.